Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, and it is now a course at NYU and an elective towards the journalism certificate. Every week, I speak with novelists, with authors, with writers of every niche to talk about their tips, their tricks, their strategies, and how the sauce is made, including creative advice. I'll talk about essays and articles and share my own experience from 3 decades of publishing. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes, and follow along on Substack, where I share special clips for subscribers only at estelleserasmus.substack.com. Hi, everybody. It's Estelle Erasmus, your host for Freelance Writing Direct. And today I'm so happy to have Sally Wiener Grotta with us for the program. She's an award-winning writer, photographer, and speaker whose books include The Winter Boy and JoJo. And her articles, essays, and stories have appeared in a score of publications. Her 2 most recent books are Of Being Women, a collection of feminist science fiction, and the one we're going to talk about today, Daughters of Eve, an essay-based discussion and journaling workbook. And it mines the tales of biblical matriarchs to explore modern life's concerns and crises. So, Sally, I'm so thrilled to have you with the program. Welcome.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here, Estelle.
And Sally and I connected decades ago when I'm still a member of ASJA, which is the American Society of Journalists and Authors, and Sally was a member at the time. And I think that's how we first connected, maybe through the New York chapter. I was doing publicity for the New York chapter.
Yes.
Wow, this is like I'm thinking way back here.
Oh, yes. We both were, of course, just teenagers.
Yes, of course, so young. And we kept in touch peripherally, like through social media. And then we're both members of the Authors Guild. And I saw Sally did a post and I thought, well, that's Sally. All right. And this sounds really interesting. Number one, the subject matter is fascinating. You became like an accidental biblical student because The Daughters of Eve is 12 stories featuring women from the Bible.
Yes.
And it's fascinating. So can you talk a little bit? We're going to get into also mechanics of workbook structure, but can you talk about the genesis of this book?
Well, the genesis is a very roundabout thing. About, how many years ago is it now? I've been working on this novel now for about 7 years that I'm working on, called Women of a New Moon. And my rabbi suggested, the story is the aftermath of a hate crime in which 6 women are traumatized by a hate crime. They all experienced it. And they gather around the widow of the rabbi who was killed at the time to form a Torah study group, ostensibly to help her. They're all broken women. And they get together to talk about the women of the Bible. And I went, great story idea, great hook. I didn't know enough about the women of the Bible to do it. So I joined a Torah study group that my rabbi actually formed because I asked her to. And I became obsessed. That's the right word. Because I'm a feminist, and the stories of the women of the Bible, such as Eve, such as Miriam and Rebecca, they are minuscule pieces of the Bible. It's a totally patriarchal book. You just put into it whatever you want to. But what I was also reading the interpretations through the millennia, and the interpretations, which varied depending upon the culture and the time, were again patriarchal societies essentially telling us what they expected and wanted women to be. And I got angrier and angrier. Although not everybody, there were some wonderful poetic interpretations. Don't get me wrong; it's not an extremist situation, but I was wrestling with these texts as you're supposed to. You're supposed to wrestle with them, and I started writing essays, and the essays grew. And then again, my rabbi, who is a good friend, Rabbi Peg Kirschenbaum, said, "You know, I know these people at Bayit. They're a creative incubator and they're publishing books, and I think you need to connect with them." Suddenly, Daughters of Eve was born. And I'm almost finished my novel finally after 7 years, but Daughters of Eve came out first, and I'm really thrilled with the relationship I had with my editors at Daughters of Eve. I love the cover. Did you see the cover? It's the Matisse.
Oh, beautiful.
And I love it. I love it because it was possible to do with the copyright legalities. We had the cover artist change it so that it isn't all Caucasian women, but it's not racially defined women. We're using actually Gauguin colors. So it's alive. It's women dancing together, which is what this book is for. It's for us to connect over discussions and explore who we are while we're dancing together, wrestling with the texts.
So I want to kind of break down some of these stories because you talk about the original Esau and Isaac from the point of view of their mothers and that relationship and how the primary wife was barren at 80 years of age. And I believe that's Sarah.
Yes.
So then she had somebody who effectively worked for her go to her husband's bed and I'm here for you because you want a kid and she wants a kid. And then as with Housewives of Beverly Hills, as with any Bravo TV show, you know, when romance and power and hierarchy and throw religion in the mix, that all gets mixed together. It's a conflagration.
Yes.
So they were fighting Agar, who had Ishmael. And so she started denigrating the barren one. And then the barren one had a baby.
Yes.
Because
So,
you know. So these women were catfighting, right? And the patriarchy, I mean, look, I grew up in the patriarchy as well as we live in it. But, you know, when you look at the Torah, it's like, I'm going to get water from the well. Oh, I met a maiden. I'm gonna marry her, or I'm gonna have a baby with her, or I'm gonna bring her back to my wife and say, hey, we're adding to the past. I mean, this is like the men just had this total entitlement, and the women, as women throughout history have to do, had to navigate it. They had to navigate the relationships, they had to navigate using their sexuality, which that was really their only currency in so many of
in
these.
many cases, yes. I would say that as the stories evolve, the Torah is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, and then the Tanakh takes over. So as you go from Torah to Tanakh, there is a maturity that does start to happen where women do become entitled. Deborah was a judge, and the head of the Israelite army obeyed her.
Wow.
You have Ruth and Naomi. You start with Sarah and Hagar in the first relationship between women. And a man once said to me when I was quite young and quite single that beautiful women can't hate each other because certain kinds of men can't imagine how deep our friendships can be. That when you get women together, that's why I asked for dancing women on the cover. When we get together, we are so mutually supportive and we really understand each other. Well, you have Ruth and Naomi, who start out as Ruth wants to follow Naomi, her mother-in-law. They both lost their husbands, back to Bethlehem. Naomi doesn't want her. You know, one is Jewish, one isn't. And this is a complication. They end up being a family unit. And when Ruth has a child, Naomi is essentially the grandmother, raises the child with Ruth. I mean, so there is a growth in it. It isn't entirely black and white matriarchy.
Yes, it starts that way. And I love the original premise that you start with, which is Eve. And it's kind of a discussion topic. What if Eve had not eaten the apple and there would have been this complete,
Hmm.
everything would have been taken care of, like kind of putting God in the ultimate sugar daddy role.
Yes,
You're in the
exactly.
Garden of Eden. It's like paradise. Everything is, I know, I put everything in a pop culture framework. This is what I do.
Well,
So everybody's needs would be taken care of,
mhm.
but where is the autonomy and the agency and the self-direction in that situation?
And
And does morality even exist if
mhm.
you're getting every need? It's sort of like a thing that I say all the time. Absolute power corrupts, and getting everything you want is absolute power. I do believe that.
Well, I
Yeah,
would disagree with you to a certain extent, very respectfully, that in that situation, Adam and Eve had no power, but they were kept very nicely, as well as my dogs are kept. My
okay.
dogs have warmth and love and food and entertainment when they look out at the horses next door. They live a very good life.
Yeah.
Are they thinking moral creatures? No, they are creatures. And so the question is, the whole book is set up to be a discussion workbook. So every essay is filled with questions, and then there are additional questions to discuss, although a number of people are using it as a journaling guide too. But I saw it as a way of listening to each other. But so the first essay is, if you could be magically transported into Eve's body just before she picked the apple,
Right.
would you pick it and would you eat it? And I've asked this question as I was preparing the essay. A number of people said, no, I wouldn't eat it. Life is horrible here. But for me and for a number of other people, absolutely. Because the human chiaroscuro, the darkness and the light that is humanity, requires that we have the potential of darkness in order for us to choose lightness. So therefore, having everything given to us and no choices, that's the issue. No choices. You can't be a moral creature, because a moral creature, a moral human being, requires having the option of going dark. And being a moral, ethical human being requires making that choice every single day of our lives.
Like you said here, like one of your discussion questions is, if you could talk to Sarah and Hagar privately before the troubles between them began, what would you say to each of them? I mean, it's before the fights began,
Yeah.
before the wars began, before the separation that resonates till today. So your idea of doing this workbook was to elicit discussion, and people are using it as journaling also. How did you go about structuring it? How did you go about choosing? I mean, there are maybe not that many, but there are a lot of women in the Bible, and you mention a lot of them. I mean, you include Miriam, who is Moses's sister, and she had a role. You included the Pharaoh's daughter, the one who fished Moses out of the Nile.
Mm-hmm.
You included so many of the important women that I wasn't even that aware of in
Right.
their roles. So how did you decide on what women to use?
That was a difficult decision, and so difficult that I am actually talking to Bayit about possibly doing a second book. And the structure of the book is there are 12 modules, so that if a discussion group met once a month, they'd have a year's worth of material. And there's an essay, it's a personal essay. I describe as objectively as I can the original text. And I then go into some people's interpretations. Then I go into how I relate to it, how my life relates to it, because I'm trying to open up, this is all part of the essay, but I'm trying to open up people's expectations so that they then can put themselves into the discussion, into the essay, into the story. Because as you and I both know, in any book, in any story, the story we write is not the story other people read, that because they're putting themselves into it. So by putting myself into it and explaining how it affects me and my life, I am hoping that the people reading it and discussing it will be able to put themselves in. So then each essay has a number of questions. And then, as you said, we have follow-up questions like that one about Sarah and Hagar, 4 to 5 to 6 essay discussion questions per module. So that if a group, like say a women's discussion group, they could be in a church, a synagogue, a community center, it could be at a university. If it doesn't even have to be all women, because I've had a couple of men object to the fact that I'm focusing on women and they're fascinated by the essays too. So people who get together once a month to discuss one of these could then have a year's worth of material for a group. And I was very thrilled with the way they formatted it, because they have lots of blank pages for people to write notes. And I loved that.
That's a great tactic. And I think with any kind of a workbook, you want to be able to have that, place for rumination, especially you're asking such deep questions. Like as you evolved, and you said the women evolved, like you had Tamar speaking truth to power.
Yeah.
And that was the title of your essay on Tamar. And then you give the background. She's Judah's daughter-in-law, and she was somebody she became a widow. And yet they kind of owned the rights to her fertility rights in some odd, familial way. Judah had another son, because in those days, if a son died, the other one could take the place. And just by, I guess, reciting.
It's called a Levirate marriage, where the surviving son marries the widow of his brother if the brother did not have an heir. So then he could produce an heir for the brother, and it wouldn't be his son. And of course, the surviving son objected. His name was Onan, and he objected to that his seed would be producing a son that would not be his. So he did something that a lot of people say now is sinful, because he spilled his seed on the ground when he had intercourse with the woman, with Tamar.
Okay.
And so spilling your seed became onanism. There's so much in each of these stories. I picked and chose various aspects.
But that made her become what you called a chained woman, which
Yes.
that she really had no recourse. She couldn't marry somebody else, while the son then was a younger son who wasn't even of age. And so she had to maybe wait a decade for him. And in the meanwhile, her fertility was at risk. It was the whole thing. So she ended up advocating for herself with Judah in a way that was probably very unusual at the time for a woman who really didn't have a voice, really didn't have power, had societal restrictions on her. And so I do like that was one of the essays, because it's a great discussion. And your question for that was, describe a time when you or someone you know experienced a chained woman's type of social helplessness. How did you or she, he, they handle it? Looking back on it, what do you wish you had done? So this is really bringing out a lot of questions and opinions. And I also like in the beginning of the workbook, you put a pledge that we see these things on social media, like everyone has to be nice and everyone has to be respectful. And I like that you're including that in the book, that everyone signs on to it who's part of the discussion group.
And also that everything should be private, because we are asking others to share themselves.
Yes.
And so just allow it to be a private, safe environment.
Yes.
And do not attack people. You can argue ideas, but never attack people. I love arguing ideas. That's why, that's how I learn. I learn from other people's ideas that are contradictory to mine. I love that.
No, and that's part of the American way, I guess,
Yes, very much.
It's
supposed to be. Just to clarify one thing, Onan was killed, supposedly for spilling his seed. And what Tamar does is she actually disguises herself, because she's a chained woman. She's sent back to her father's home, where she is she's a burden. And Judah hasn't called her back. She isn't allowed to marry. She isn't allowed to have a life. So she puts herself in the crossroads where she knows Judah's going to be coming by. And he, just because she was a single woman alone, he presumed she was a prostitute. But you see, in those days, marriage had to do with nothing but a person making a pledge and then having sex. A man making a pledge to the woman and then having sex. Well, Judah had already promised Tamar that she would be part of his family, that he was going to bring her back into the family. So when he propositioned her and had sex with her, that's a sealing. That seals the two of them together. He doesn't recognize her. She's veiled. How could he not recognize her? We have this often. We have this in the Leah story too. It's that men don't recognize women. Baloney. So when he hears that she has fallen pregnant through harlotry, because how else could it have happened? She's sequestered with her father and not with the tribe. He orders her burned. But she had taken his seal and his staff as promise for payment, supposedly promise for payment. And she sent them to him and saying, this is the father. Wow. And he acknowledged. And she did have twins and the whole bit. She did have children. Apparently, supposedly, he never touched her again, but she was one of his wives. And their sons together were very important in the lineage of King David. So when you look at the story from Tamar's point of view, it's always taught from Judah's point of view. But if you look at it from Tamar's point of view, that sense of helplessness, how many of us have felt that? All of it. I don't know a woman who hasn't felt that at some time. Some men have too, but some fight it with feeling empowered. A lot of us stay silent because we are intimidated. And I love that she said, here, look at these things. Look at this staff and this seal.
I mean, why did he give it to her? That's another story.
Well, you see, he thought she was a harlot.
Right.
And he promised to send her a goat in payment, right. But he didn't have it on him. So she said, okay, give me those things in pledge. But then when he sent the kid, there was no prostitute at the crossroads because there never was a prostitute at the crossroads. She left. And so she held on to those things.
Yeah. It's
gutsy woman. Gutsy. Yeah.
She very much advocated for herself. So let's talk about structuring, because this is focused for writers and authors and people who want to write different types of books or publish different types of articles. And so I'm fascinated by the workbook structure and how you broke it down and decided the different elements. Did you make an outline and say, okay, I know how I'm going to do it? And how did you even get that idea? Like, did you see a different workbook and said, ooh, that's a great structure? Or did you just come up with it?
I love that you have an interview series that's for writers to explore this, like your book. It's a wonderful thing. Most writers will know the expression, I'm a pantser, not an outliner. In other words, I write by the seat of my pants. But there's so much organization that goes on in my head that I have there. I knew I wanted essays. I knew I wanted to be a discussion book because I was doing all this research during COVID when I was alone with my dog Shayna in my home for months on end. And I was struggling. I was wrestling with these texts through these essays, and I wanted to talk it out with people. And so my essays are filled with questions, and then I had other questions. So it was a natural thing for me to say, okay, I want it to be a discussion workbook. When I first talked to Bayit about it, that's what I said I wanted, a discussion workbook. So I saw it as, okay, I want a year's worth of discussions. I knew that I wanted that. So the structure just fell in place. There's the essay. Here are some more questions I have. Here's room for your questions. Now here's another essay. There's been other books where I had to think out my structure, and it evolved as I wrote. Yeah. But this one, it was just a clear-cut thing. Yes, I have seen workbooks. We've all seen workbooks throughout our lives. I mean, it's probably starting in elementary school. We had to answer questions about something we read. But I like the way the editors at Bayit laid it out. I think they did a way that it's clear, and there's space in the original stories, there's space in the essays and in the questions for the reader, for the group to put themselves into it, to create their own, what is called midrash. Midrash is simply a Hebrew word that means I am creating an interpretation of an original Hebraic text. And so I was shocked when several rabbis said to me, "Oh, you're writing midrash." I went, "No, I'm just writing essays." But I'm really looking forward to having readers respond with what their interpretations were. I'm hoping they will send me messages and I can then put it on my website for other readers to experience. This is a very different book from anything I've ever written, because I really feel like my readers are my collaborators on this as it grows.
I like that. And so there's some fraught topics throughout, or it could be looked at that way. Was it difficult to touch on it? And I think you did it in a very graceful, elegant way, and very much leaving it up for interpretation and discussion. And that's very clearly laid out. But did you wrestle with anything in terms of putting it down on the page?
I didn't wrestle with putting it down on the page. I wrestled with reading it and reading some of the interpretations that were very fraught for me. And again, as I said, it's not black and white, because some of the interpretations were exquisite and very humanitarian and meaningful for me. But there were times when I would get angry. Well, when I get angry or emotional, that's when I really write. And I really write well when I'm emotional. I do believe that one of the important things whenever I write is to be in touch with my feelings and be honest about them. I feel that there's a real, to bend over backwards to be honest about what I'm writing. It has to be authentic. First of all, otherwise I'm bored and it's not interesting to me. But also, our readers deserve that. They deserve our honesty. Some issues have to be handled sensitively, but they have to be true. They have to ring true for me and for the reader. If it doesn't feel true to me, you're not going to want to read it.
Yes.
And I feel that's one of the more important things. But it's also having respect for my reader. I have great deal of respect for my readers, to the extent that I am not going to give them dreck. I am going to fight hard. That's why it's taken me 6 years to write this novel. I fight hard to make it, to not spoon feed things to them. They have brains. They don't need to have things spoon fed to them.
Yeah.
And to give them my best every time.
I love that. Sally, where can people find you on social media?
Well, on social media, it's Sally Wiener Grotta. Wiener spelled like a hot dog. I'm on Facebook. I'm still on Twitter, and I call it Twitter because I have so many good people connecting with me, and that's Sally W. Grotta, and that's with an A, Grotta. I'm on LinkedIn, but I'm not there that often. I'm on YouTube because I do my own little interview series called What If, Why Not, How? And I am also on Blue Sky, sorta.
I'm sort of there too.
And I'm sort of trying to gear up to get on Substack. My website, as you can see here, is sallywienergrotta.com. And if you misspell Wiener, it'll still get you there because I bought that URL just for the
Clever.
And that has information about my books. I have several books. I've been writing since I've known Estelle. Also, I'm a speaker and I'm a fine art photographer. So you'll see information about that. I do still have a blog because I love writing essays, and that's how this book started. And I also, and people seem to still come to it, even though it's all social media today. And I do invite guest blogs. There are guidelines in there are very specific guidelines because what I really want are essays. I invite your listeners to look at the guidelines. I also, by the way, invite your listeners to get on my website under Writer. You'll see sample chapter, Daughters of Eve. You can download a free sample chapter.
Wonderful. And I'll put that all in the show notes. All
Uh,
right. Well, thank you so much, Sally. It's been a pleasure having you speak with me today.
It was wonderful talking with you, Estelle. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Follow me at EstelleSErasmus.com on my website and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.